Hey, everybody. Welcome to Dear Joe Biden on Acronym TV. This is the show, once again, where we believe that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Walking in this metaphor being, let's get rid of that fascist in the White House. Chewing gum, of course, being, we have to agitate and organize and speak to Joe Biden and his supporters from the left. So I'm very pleased to welcome to the show today Shahid Buttar, who is actually campaigning to do that very same thing inside of Congress. He's running because of California's unique primary system as a Democrat on the ballot to Nancy Pelosi's left on November 3rd. Shahid, thanks so much for joining me. Good to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me, Dennis. It's great to be with you.
So since that victory in the primary that put you on the ballot on November 3rd against Nancy Pelosi, your campaign has experienced some significant bumps in the road. Two related kind of allegations and scandals, and we just want to address them one at a time. First, there's the Medium post or column from Elizabeth Croydon that alleges some sexual harassment back over a decade ago that was followed quickly upon by many prominent activists who know both Elizabeth and you, including some people we know in common, Medea Benjamin, Kevin Zeese, et cetera, who came to your support. And then additionally, an Intercept article that reported on this had to update it with really quite a bit of context. And I want to be careful here because, you know, we do want to believe women when they come forth with these kinds of allegations. They're very serious allegations, and we should take them very seriously. But there does seem to be a pattern of past behavior separate from that particular allegation that calls all those things into question. Before we get into the staff turnover and the DSA rescinding of the recommendation of your campaign, what do you have to say about that first allegation?
Well, it certainly was never true, and the recent reporting to actually address the facts has made that clear. I've been accused by Elizabeth Croydon of acts including murder and human trafficking for years, long before the harassment claim emerged. And that was the person that my former colleagues chose to use to get their concerns about the workplace into the press. I did know Liz Croydon in the early 2000s. She claims that I repeatedly expressed interest in her. Just to be clear, I've never expressed interest in Liz Croydon, ever, not once. And the letter that you referenced was from a number of people who had shared social settings with us and were able to speak to both my character and the pattern of accusations that I knew about at the time with Liz. I didn't know half of it because since the smear campaign targeting me, there's been so many people that came forward to say that they had their own experiences of being accused by Liz, well beyond people I'd ever met before, an entire community in Los Angeles, apparently. And there's a journalist, a grassroots journalist, podcaster, her name's Jacqueline Thompson. And I from reading her pieces, I learned about entirely other patterns with my accuser. And I committed early on not to punching down, so I'm not even going to get into it. I will just say that the truth is crazier than any fiction here. Let me rephrase that. The truth is wilder than any fiction. I didn't mean to use an polite term, but it certainly isn't grounded in any fact. And the only reason that these allegations ever saw the light of day and were brought to the press is because former colleagues of mine who I had replaced on my team after I won the primary, reached out to Liz and then brought her story forward. And, you know, I won't comment on the ethics of that either, but it certainly does speak to the extent to which the claim is unreliable. And I'm glad that The Intercept acknowledged that in their updated piece, even if they failed to issue a correction, and even if it did take them a month to get that part of the story right, and they still haven't gotten the rest of the story right. And it has been a disturbing reflection of the state of journalism to see these stories aired and spread. And they have had real world impacts that are unfortunate, not just for me, but particularly for the movement and the kids in cages that Pelosi funded and the, you know, whoever will be bombed in the next war that she and hopefully Joe Biden, and not our criminal president, will be in charge of, promoting. And of course, the reason I'm running for Congress is we can't settle for that kind of policy paradigm, whether it's a Republican office or a Democrat in office. And I'm happy to get into the other stuff that came up too.
Yeah, and so related to that, Jasper Wild, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, your former campaign manager, has written a follow-up piece where she writes, quote, "Truly, I left the Buttar campaign because it was a toxic workplace environment in which personal and professional boundaries were repeatedly violated." So, I personally have had some limited campaign experiences. Some viewers know that I started out as Jill Stein's communications director in the 2016 campaign. And the truth is, I found it exhausting. It's a 60-hour or more work week, and in some ways, it can be toxic. I was probably looking for a union gig and an easy job at my age. It was not that. What have you learned from this experience? And is it possible that there was a toxic work environment? And what have you addressed within your campaign?
Thanks for the question. I take the concerns very seriously, precisely because the character that was constructed of me is not who I am. I do care about these issues very deeply. And they are ones both that I took seriously internally in terms of making sure that we don't model the culture that was characterized by my critics, and also to see where I could learn. Among the things that I've had an opportunity to learn from all this is the importance of seeking a strategic alignment with people who I hire. When I launched the campaign, when you run against the Speaker of the House, you don't have people beating down your door to work for you. And at the time, I basically hired people who were willing to do the job and who had some skill sets. And their inclination, their approach to the work, their strategic alignment with my own, those were not criteria that I particularly emphasized, frankly, because I had raised some money. I needed to hire staff to run the race, and I took the people who were willing to work with me. And as the campaign got heavier, more and more people wanted to work with us. And that's one of the reasons why we shifted the staff after the primary to bring on a bunch of veterans from Bernie Sanders' campaign. Our deputy campaign manager today ran his San Francisco office. We have other people at the table, including his national development director. Until she went back to her job at Nonprofit Advocacy for Tenants' Rights, we were working with his California State Deputy Data Director. So we vastly upgraded the skill set of the people working on the team. And I get the sense that maybe some of the people who had worked on the team had some feelings around that. There certainly were very profound disagreements about campaign strategy. And that's what I had understood the tension to emerge around. That was, we had very explicit conversations about it at the time. At the time, misogyny never came up or figured into the conversations. The first time I heard that reflection from my former staff was in the press after they'd reached out to Liz to coordinate this campaign to promote a narrative. And at the end of the day, all I can say is that in addition to my former staff having shifted their stories around why they left, I just acknowledge the difference between impact and intent. And I have never intended to treat anybody differently, whether according to gender or age or race or anything else. I do defer to experience, and my former staff, frankly, didn't have a lot. The reflection on what they called a toxic workplace environment, it wasn't one that I heard when they worked with me. It wasn't one that I heard after they left the campaign. It wasn't one that my current staff heard. My current staff met with my former staff before they took the job, and they had very frank conversations. They all know each other. And those very frank conversations particularly focused on my former staff's lack of confidence in my campaign strategy. At the end of the day, the campaign strategy was vindicated because when we transitioned to the new staff, the campaign grew dramatically. And that's the point. I was trying to execute a campaign. I had a staff that was unwilling. And I think there's a tension. One person has described it to me as, in some circles, people have a hard time distinguishing between conflict and abuse. And when I offer my staff direction to, for instance, make sure that they're getting back to volunteers who wanted to participate, that's not me berating them. That's me holding my campaign staff accountable to execute the campaign that I'm responsible for delivering my donors and my volunteers. One sort of layer here that I think is worth noting, the narrative that was presented in the press suggested that my former colleagues were aggrieved workers with a bad boss. And just to be clear, these were workers who had their own sense of what to do and were not so interested in running my campaign. Mm-hmm. And the reason I transitioned the staff was to get people in place who would run my campaign, our campaign, the campaign to going to replace Pelosi.
So was Jasper, did Jasper resign or did you replace Jasper?
we moved everybody out of the team. I didn't fire anyone. I'm very grateful for that. Again, we had very frank conversations around strategic differences, and I made clear the direction in which we were moving. And each of them chose to make their own decisions. And, I was grateful for them choosing to make those decisions, and we moved into a stronger space by recruiting people with more experience. But again, the departures for each of those people, and this was about half a dozen people who left over 3 months, and the press presented it as if it was a dozen people who left all at once, and that was also untrue. But this trickle of people who moved beyond our campaign, in each of those cases, that was basically a reflection of their looking at the field, seeing the steepness of the climb that I was running on the basis of their experience, which has been confined to local politics. I don't think they came to understand how we could win. And frankly, given the campaign they were trying to build, I don't think we could have won with that. The campaign that we built after we transitioned the staff, that was putting us in a position to win until my former team, brought Liz's false claims to the press and then amplified them to create this narrative that is in fact not true. One thing I should share here is that multiple people came forward with documentary evidence that my former staff had tried to recruit them to participate in what one of those volunteers described in writing as a smear campaign. Mm-hmm. And it took a month for that to reach the press. Every outlet that wrote the first set of articles, San Francisco Chronicle, Mission Local, Bay Area Reporter, The Intercept, they all saw the evidence that sources they had quoted on the record were engaged in something other than telling the truth. And they saw sources quoted on the record reach out to a person at the center of their claimed narrative. Before Liz Croyden's story came to the press, before the allegations of a toxic workplace came to the press, the original story that my former staff were telling was that I had a pattern of inappropriate behavior with my volunteers. That's the subject of the DSA resolution that The Intercept quoted in July, the week of my birthday. And that resolution, even when DSA did move to rescind its endorsement, they rescinded that, they repudiated that resolution that my former colleagues wrote. So just to make the point here, the whole thing is circular. I moved some people off my staff. Those people found an accuser. They wrote a resolution for DSA. They put it in the press. And as the story fell apart, no one in the local press was willing to actually cover the facts. So for a month, these stories that were based on a fabricated narrative were rattling around, not just the local press, they then got internationally amplified by The Intercept. And, I would say that it's a failure of the press. I would say that it's a failure of press ethics. I also know that I'm a brown man falsely accused and presumptively judged in spite of evidence and witnesses. And that's worse than just a failure of the press. And it's worse, frankly, than what happened to me, because I'm not just a person, I'm a candidate. There are a set of issues I'm promoting in the world, and they were all marginalized because of a willingness to suspend rationality and reason and an inclination to privilege accusation before facts. And I'm very happy to be judged on the basis of my acts. And my acts included giving feedback to my colleagues that apparently was challenging for them. I have apologized for any extent to which that was gendered. I would just note that this is a point worth emphasizing. I referenced before how my actions, anybody's actions, can have impacts beyond our intentions. And I recognize that, and I acknowledge it, and I own it. The buck stops with me on this campaign. And if anybody experienced gendered treatment, that's something that I'm very eager to address and stop. It's one reason why I've checked in with my current team and frankly, other people I've worked with in the past, just to grow assured that this is not a problem that other people have experienced. Incidentally, I just note that if the concern is workplace misogyny, some people might be interested in the experience of my current staff, and the journalists to this point haven't been so much. But the point I want to come back to here is that if intents and impacts can diverge, that's true not just in my workplace, it's also true with the press. And I understand that a lot of people might have had the intention of covering the facts here. And the impact was not that. And whatever the intention might have been to conduct ethical journalism, the impact was a brown person being falsely accused and judged in public. And so we have words for that. So let's talk about those words that you talked about. A smear campaign. One would presume that smear campaign is born out of a belief of the Croyden allegations and to a lesser extent the hostile work environment. And
I don't want to minimize that, but again, having worked on campaigns, it's a stressful job. It's not a regular job. It's a limited time job. So, are you suggesting that there was a racial intent in the smear campaign?
Not intent, but an impact. There's an unavoidable racial impact. If you have a brown person falsely accused by a white woman, we have seen that pattern in our nation's history any number of times. I don't think in this particular fact setting, but the point is, if intent doesn't necessarily describe impact, whatever the intentions of my former staff, whatever the intention of the local press, whatever the intention of the political organizations, the impact of those stories, the impact of the local organization's decisions, it has the impact of falsely accusing a man of color for a thing I didn't do. There's more elements of race here. I mean, for instance, it's not just the case that I was falsely accused. I was also accused of misogyny as a Muslim man, and there is a well-established trope in that particular characterization, right? I mean, that's some portion of the reason why we've been at war in Afghanistan for the last 20 years is supposedly to liberate Muslim women from the misogyny of that culture, right? That's a narrative I've certainly heard in some feminist circles. Another example of this, the text messages that I described. Just to be clear, I didn't describe this as a smear campaign. My volunteer described it as a smear campaign when my former staff tried to get her to lie about something to throw me under the bus. And we have texts, messages that the press outlet saw and ignored between a white man who I had employed and a white woman trying to get her to say that I, a brown man, had done something inappropriate with her. And she says in the text messages, "This is sick. I'm not going to participate in your smear campaign." And then they went forward anyway, promoting that narrative. That's the narrative that was in the DSA resolution that they wrote. That's the narrative that the Intercept internationally amplified, even as Democratic Socialists of America in San Francisco stripped their resolution of all the details, recognizing that they couldn't even stand behind any of the facts. And the point here is that the facts and the narrative ran in opposite directions. And it's one thing to say that that's unethical reporting. You could describe it as a failure of the press. When I describe it as having a racial impact, I'm just describing the impact.
Let's talk about the impact on your campaign. And here, I think there's some room for nuance about how you define victory. Running within the Democratic Party, the most obvious way to define victory is unseating Nancy Pelosi, who's held that seat for 3 decades and who has helped promote a foreign policy that is, I'll get to in a minute, that is kind of the root of the American empire, evil empire, imperialism, and the reason that we don't have money to spend on all these nice things that your campaign is standing for. Is there a way for you to define victory after November 3rd, or however many days or weeks we're going to have to wait to learn the results? Is there a way for your campaign to define victory that falls short of actually unseating Nancy Pelosi?
I wouldn't say falling short of. In some respects, I'd say it beyond. I describe capturing the seat as a tactical victory, and that is certainly the tactical victory that we seek. There are strategic victories that we've already won on the way to it. So this spring, we helped Congress pass, because Pelosi did not support until we pushed her, the most visionary update to labor rights in a generation. That's the Protecting Right to Organize Act. Similarly, the Justice and Policing Act. I've spent over a decade arguing for any number of civil rights reforms that Nancy Pelosi and the rest of the Democratic leadership have refused to embrace for years. And this spring, in the face not only of a grassroots movement around the country responding to the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and too many people whose names we say, Nancy Pelosi also showed up vastly to her own left. And the question here is, does she do that in a world where she doesn't actually face another Democrat on the ballot for the first time in her career? It's a counterfactual. I can't prove that our campaign was the thing that moved us over the top. And I wouldn't claim that we are, because ultimately I think it's the grassroots movements, the labor movement, that forced her to show up for the Protecting Right to Organize Act. It's the movement for Black Lives and all of us who've been in the streets who forced her to show up in the Justice and Policing Act. But in each of those contexts, as well as half a dozen others, saving the post office, congressional war powers, impeachment, I could go on, our campaign basically operated like a fulcrum on a lever. For 33 years, I've watched Nancy Pelosi ignore grassroots social movements. I've been her constituent for 20 of those years, and she's never shown up for any of the grassroots social movements of this city. And she's showing up for some social movements now. And I don't think that's because she learned anything new. I think it's because she's being held accountable by a viable challenge for the first time in her 33-year career. And because we are a fulcrum, we're able to amplify the pressure of the social movements that are clamoring for. This spring, it was preventing our criminal president from going to war in Iran. And we've forced Nancy Pelosi to show up, and unfortunately after the fact, for congressional war powers that she refused to support when it mattered. In that case, there were amendments to the Defense Authorization Act introduced by two other members of Congress from the Bay Area, Ro Khanna in San Jose and Barbara Lee in Oakland, both of whom stand vastly to Nancy Pelosi's left. Just to be clear, Pelosi is by far the most conservative member of the Bay Area's congressional delegation, and she enforces her sensibility across Congress. And by removing her from the body, which we aim still to do, having already established these strategic victories, I aim to send a signal, very loud signal across Washington, that no centrist incumbent is safe. And that's in fact the place we are at. Every centrist Democrat has paved the road to Trump's authoritarianism. They funded DHS's budgets. They expanded his surveillance powers. They gave him a bigger military budget than has ever been given to any chief executive in the history of our species. Yeah. While they correctly describe him as a criminal. If he's a criminal, why are they bending over to expand his powers and give him unlimited budgets to
while clapping back
whatever havoc that he will?
State of the Union speech, Nancy Pelosi then turns around and signs the very budget that you're talking about.
That's right.
White in homage to women's right to the suffragette movement, which agitated and organized outside the two-party system to get women the right to vote. I'd like to shift to discussing foreign policy and a path that you would champion that is different from the path that Nancy Pelosi's been holding down for the Democrats for the past 30 years. And you're a poet, so maybe you can help me, because I've been trying to get this following phrase into the popular mouths of folks for a long time. It's a mouthful, but I describe U.S. foreign policy as a blowback-inducing homicidal bull in a cultural, religious, and geopolitical china shop. Manifest destiny's child. You describe an experience of you. The reason you even grew up in the United States was that you were fleeing from U.S.-led coups in other countries. Talk about your personal experience and how that informs your view of U.S. foreign policy.
Thank you for raising that question. I don't get a chance often to speak about this history, but in my family, but I think it is relevant both to this moment and certainly to my race. I was born in England in 1974. My parents had immigrated there from Pakistan. And the reason they had left is because the minority sect of Islam to which we belong has been derided as heretical in some Muslim countries. And because we didn't have religious freedom, and that was imposed by a military government, a government that was subjected to serial military coups. And this is a pattern, frankly, that we've seen around the world of military supported by the U.S. military-industrial complex toppling foreign democracies, more or less at the drop of a hat. This has happened across Latin America dozens of times. And I am a product of that pattern. My family fled Pakistan because the military rule that followed the coups, they didn't respect civil rights. They didn't respect basic human rights like the freedom of belief and conscience. And so my family fled to a place that did. And when they got to the UK, they discovered very pervasive racial discrimination. And they were there for the better part of, in my dad's case, about 15 years. My mom was there a good deal longer than that. And then we came to the States, like a lot of people over our nation's history, seeking some combination of freedom and opportunity. And that liberty principle that brought my family here, that's another, not only do I existentially recognize and care about the military-industrial complex and its litany of abuses around the world, I also care very much about liberty because it's why my family is here. It's not an abstract concept to me. When I read the New Colossus, it's the poem that's inscribed in the base of the Statue of Liberty. I choke up reading that. My family was the huddled, tired masses yearning to breathe free. I understand that. That's why I'm here. And the reason why I'm here, not just in the United States, but in this race, is to defend those principles, to make sure that the door stays open, to make sure that we remain a country that can proudly speak of our commitment to human rights instead of a country falling prey to bipartisan fascism. And I've seen that fascism emerge, and I've called it that for 17 years since I graduated from law school in 2003 and moved east to fight the right wing under Bush. I've recognized what is happening. Under Obama, I talked to people about growing fascism in the United States, and a lot of smug liberals laughed at me at the time. And I'm running for Congress because I'm tired of saying I told you so. It's not satisfying at all. And I would like to actually help us step over some of these pitfalls that corporate Democrats keep dragging us into. And I see that legacy in too stark relief. I understand these issues too much to turn a blind eye to them. And I can recognize that the people we send to Congress apparently don't. And certainly Nancy Pelosi either doesn't understand it or she's an active architect in fascism. And neither of those things, obliviousness or complicity, are acceptable.
Yeah, and obviously what you know and what most of the viewers would know is that the military-industrial complex has been successful in literally planting jobs in every single congressional district in the country. So when the Democrats failed, as they did a week or so ago, to even cut the military budget by 10%, they do so knowing that if they did vote for that, they'd be cutting jobs in their district or potentially cutting jobs in their district.
Can I press on that really quick? Because it's a farce. You're right. That's how they think. But just to be clear, the co-optation of the labor movement by the military-industrial complex is one of the military-industrial complex's greatest coups. And just to be clear, if we were sincerely interested in jobs, it wouldn't be high-tech aerospace engineering jobs that we'd be investing in. We'd be investing in teachers. The programs with the highest ratio of spending to jobs, or the other way, the highest ratio of jobs to spending, is the Department of Ed. If we want to employ people, if that's the goal here, fiscal stimulus and jobs, we should be hiring more teachers. We need them desperately. We don't need more missiles. We don't need more weapons. And let's be frank about this. There are real national security threats confronting our country. They include a global pandemic. They include an aspiring tyrant who would like to stop an election from happening. They include a mounting and accelerating global climate catastrophe. No number of fighter jets or aircraft carriers can stop any of those threats. Every single one of them has entirely nothing to do with the Department of Defense. So why are we hurling record numbers, $750 billion this year in the middle of a pandemic at a Defense Department for weapons? Who are we going to use them against? I mean, why don't we spend that money on PPE? I know a bunch of nurses who could use some masks. Maybe we could get those for them instead of a bunch of fighter jets that aren't going to save anybody. The misalignment between our spending priorities and our actual documented, legitimate, acknowledged threats is at best irrational, and at worst it is corrupt. And again, whether it's irrational or corrupt, neither of those things, just like Nancy Pelosi's potential obliviousness or complicity, neither possibility is acceptable. And that's why I'm running to get a new voice for San Francisco and Washington and to score a vote to restrain the military-industrial complex, to shrink the budgets, to expose particularly executive secrets of, in too many cases, I think, sustained continuing crimes, and to make sure that we can actually be proud of our government instead of needing to hide its dirty laundry.
It's this myth of American exceptionalism that fuels all that allows us to criticize allows us to go down this whole Russiagate scandal while ignoring the fact that Hillary Clinton was on the cover of Time magazine for influencing elections in Russia, and that we do that and much worse all over the world all of the time. But you mentioned jobs. Let's just shift to that for a second.
Yeah.
By way of talking about the Green New Deal. So, and by way of tactics and how we can define victory. So again, not to harp too much, but in working for Jill Stein, I think one of the sharper points that she was able to make was to say that, when we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, our entire economy flipped to a wartime footing. And, we're still seeing the effects of that. We've never jumped off that wartime footing.
As we're describing now, right?
But if we treated the climate crisis like Pearl Harbor, and it's much worse than that, we could have the urgency to flip and shift our entire economy to get rid of fossil fuels and create jobs. And I would say that is one way that an insurgent campaign can claim victory. The very fact that the Sunrise Movement is born and AOC is championing these things, and the fact that the Green New Deal was talked about during the Democratic debates, even if those individuals failed to give credit to the Green Party for whatever tactical reasons that they decided to do, that's fine. That shit got Trojan horsed into the mainstream of presidential politics. What is, in your mind,
if I can, just to close the loop there, I would describe that as a strategic victory for our movement. So we've gotten the debate normalized. Now we need to move past strategic
campaign, and I don't know that we were that strategic about it. I think maybe we stumbled into a strategic victory, but I'll take it. I'll take it.
Yeah. And I think the goal for the movement now is having established that strategic beachhead right? And when I say strategic, I don't mean to say that we strategize it. I just mean strategic in the sense of a key piece in the project of establishing a goal. And so we've now normalized a national conversation about the need to shrug off the yoke of fossil fuel resource extraction and the opportunity to, as you were describing, invest in our actual national security imperatives. And that could lead us to everything from a federal jobs guarantee to any number of greater resiliency projects that could emerge. I mean, I'm standing in California, which is currently on fire. And there are potential ways to work around that. And they're very labor intensive, basically replicating indigenous forest management techniques that our country is not industrially set up to do. There's no profit motive in clearing underbrush from the fires. But that's exactly what a federal jobs guarantee attendant to a Green New Deal could do, is put a generation of people at work in projects that don't have market viability, but that have enormous benefit to the public in the form of climate resiliency projects. The air quality, not just in the regions that are beset by fires at the moment, but across the entire state, at one point last week was among the worst in the world. And those are public health risks, right? We should be dealing with them instead of manufacturing weapons for wars that that don't advance our interests either. And this is a point I want to just sharply distinguish between those two sets of alternatives. We could have a wartime footing to fight conflicts on the other end of the world longer than our country has ever engaged in. That's what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And the Washington Post revealed a year ago that every progress report we've ever heard from the war in Afghanistan was based on a lie. That's one option. The other option is, in the middle of a pandemic with a climate catastrophe that's inundated Houston and burned half of California, we could actually invest our resources, instead of in war, in something that might actually keep some Americans alive. That's what I'm here for. Let's keep some Americans alive. I wake up, I had a conversation with my sister recently about this. It was interesting. She discounted the extent to which her children figure into my motivation for running for office. I don't have kids of my own, but I have 9 nephews and nieces. I have 3 siblings and they each have 3 kids. And I think about them a lot. It's why I'm doing this, because I don't want them to get kicked off a cliff. And everyone's kids are getting kicked off a cliff right now because Congress is too interested in hurling money at the Pentagon and supporting CIA coups, potentially in the last year alone in Bolivia, Brazil, and Venezuela. We were talking about a pattern. It's continuing under our feet. There's at least a long-standing pattern there, and the circumstantial evidence indicates CIA involvement. We can't establish those facts because no one in Congress has done the investigation. I would like to change that. We need an investigator and an organizer in Congress, someone who will organize Congress to actively investigate the executive branch and force into the public sphere the facts that we, the people, have been denied for too long. And one of the endorsements of which I'm most proud is Senator Mike Gravel, who in a prior era read the Pentagon Papers in a congressional record. He's the reason that Daniel Ellsberg is a national hero, described by President Nixon as the most dangerous man in America at the time, and not, like Edward Snowden, in international exile. Snowden didn't have anyone like Mike Gravel in Congress willing to do the right thing when he came forward. I'm going to Congress to be the next Mike Gravel when the next Edward Snowden comes out. We need members of Congress who understand their oath of office sufficiently to show up for those principles when they matter. And at the moment, we don't have those people. We have members of Congress who we select on the basis of their fundraising acumen. Nancy Pelosi's only qualification for Congress when she went to Congress 33 years ago, she was a prolific fundraiser. And that remains her MO. And I don't think fundraising is what we need in Congress. I think we need people who understand the history enough to have shown up for our most crucial principles when they've mattered. And that's exactly what the incumbent has either refused or been unwilling to do.
You mentioned the lies that got us into this never-ending war. As a Democrat, how do you feel about at the DNC, Colin Powell, one of the faces of that lie, being invited to speak, to say nothing of John Kasich literally embodying that Robert Frost poem? There were 2 roads that were forked in a wood, It seems like the Democrats have decided there are those 10 white dudes in the Rust Belt that lost Hillary Clinton the election, and we just have to go after them.
This is why corporate Democrats keep losing. Because, and I would map this back to the tactics and strategy distinction again. They only have a tactical vision. They don't understand strategy, and they don't have a strategic view of the landscape. This is exactly why the Clinton administration is praised by some liberals as a success. They scored a lot of tactical victories because they made a bunch of strategic concessions. When you have Democratic presidents dismantling welfare and enforcing corporate rule and building mass incarceration, yeah, go figure. It's really easy to get stuff passed when you do the work of the other team for them. That was the story of the Clinton administration. That was much of the story, unfortunately, of the Obama administration. The upward transfer of wealth, the drone strikes, the crackdown on the press, the deportations, the refusal to heed any of the demands of the Occupy movement or the Ferguson uprising. That was an administration that governed from the right with a Democratic president in office. And at the end of the day, Democrats need to recognize that we do our work by advancing our principles, not simply by winning bills. If the bills advance right-wing goals, those aren't victories. The Affordable Care Act comes to mind as an example here. There were parts of it that were really important, like preventing health insurance companies from denying coverage to people with pre-existing conditions. But the structure of that bill, let's just be clear, it was engineered by a right-wing think tank because it is a massive support lever for private industry. The ACA forces Americans at the penalty of a tax burden to contract with arbitrarily priced private insurance plans. And the prices of those have gone through the roof over the last 10 years. That wasn't a people supporting measure. That was a health insurance supporting measure masquerading as a healthcare policy.
Right.
And these are examples of Democrats losing sight of the strategic landscape. What is the goal? To too many Democrats, the goal is get a bill signed or raise some money. My goal is materially improve the lives and conditions of Americans struggling with our intersecting, compounding multiple global crises. And that's the standard that Democrats haven't been held to before. I think it's why we're seeing new voices crack through the ceiling, breaking the chokehold of entrenched incumbents in districts across the country. You know, we saw the squad go to Congress in the last session. So far in this session, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush have won their races. I'm very looking forward to Alex Morse winning his race against Richie Neal. And I'm eager to join them in Congress as another voice to fight for the future and to shrug off the failures of our predatory corporate past.
Let's close by discussing a path towards an improved Medicare for all. You just outlined an industry that makes money by denying care. That shareholders for these companies make money when people die. I mean, that some people think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that, but
you're right. You're absolutely right.
That one of the most frustrating conversations I've had lately is with, I won't out a very close family member of mine who holds a high position in unions. And his hesitation about Medicare for all is summarized in the following way. He has fought for decades to give his union members, a kind of Cadillac, his words, Cadillac
right.
healthcare plan. And
right.
They've sacrificed wages, they've sacrificed pensions, they've sacrificed job security, sacrificed a lot of things to get that. How can he take that case to his members and say, they're going to be thinking, my taxes are going to go up and my health care, really their health insurance, not health care, they're different things, is going to go away. What's the case for that crowd for an improved Medicare for all?
You can get higher wages if we let everybody see a doctor. There's a difference between treating healthcare and medical care and treatment and medicine like a yacht versus like the fire department. If your house is on fire, you don't have to check your bank account before you call the fire department. The fire department goes where they're needed, not where people pay them, because we want fires to be put out when they're needed. That's a public good. Public health is a public good, particularly during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'll hit this from a couple of different areas. First, I'll get to health outcomes before I get to the specific case for union members.
Okay.
And just to, maybe one piece to reflect on your characterization of the health insurance industry, it's a healthcare denial racket. That's what the health insurance industry is, to your point.
Yeah.
And it's a cartel. It has cartel pricing dynamics because it has artificial government support. The point I'd want to make particularly about to the union members is that if you let everybody establish an access to healthcare as a matter of right, it then frees up your bargaining power that you've traded for these Cadillac plans to then get better wages and better job security and fewer hours and more workplace protections. Labor has been forced to squander its bargaining power on a basic human right that our government has refused to acknowledge. There's a whole further piece here, which is that Medicare for all will be the biggest job stimulus opportunity of any industrial policy we could imagine, because it will immediately remove from the expense statements of every major corporation one of their biggest expenses. For Detroit auto manufacturers, their biggest expense is employee healthcare, not steel for the cars. And when we take those costs and, like every other country in the world, put them on the government, it will enable businesses in every sector to consider a hiring boom. That's going to be good for labor. I think there's a huge opportunity here to recognize that our dedication to for-profit healthcare hasn't only undermined human rights, and it hasn't only driven homelessness, and it hasn't only kept entirely too many Americans awake at night when they should be sleeping trying to recover from their illnesses. It also inhibits job creation. It undermines our economy. It limits people's prospects. It forces their decisions about where to live and how to live, because healthcare is an existential need, especially for people with chronic conditions. And it shouldn't be a locus of coercion. That's the reality today, is that healthcare is coercive because people make concessions in their life choices in order to get it. But nobody should have to do that. Nobody in other countries has to do that. How can we walk around talking about living in a land of the free when we don't even have the most basic human right that people in other industrialized countries have long enjoyed? And the last way I put this is that to be dedicated to that for-profit predatory healthcare paradigm before the global pandemic of the coronavirus, it was brutal and it was vicious then. I'll tell a quick story. A supporter of mine, a physician here at the University of California, San Francisco, spoke to me about the spend down to Medicaid, which any chronically ill patient undergoes. And every physician who deals in palliative care or in other specialties that deal with people who are recovering or dealing with chronic illnesses or terminal illnesses recognizes this dynamic of people being bled dry of every penny they've ever earned. 40% of cancer patients lose their life savings within the first year. Yeah. And the spend down to Medicaid ends up with sick people in the street. That's our idea of healthcare, is take sick people, treat their illness as an excuse for extraction, bleed them dry of every cent they've ever made, and then when we're done squeezing them dry of anything that they can be used to make profit for, kick them into the street and forget about them. That's our established policy, and it's not humane. Right. It's not acceptable. It's not American, and it's not tolerable. And I'm here to make sure that we do better. And in the middle of a pandemic, it's not just brutal and vicious. It's stupid. It is senselessly stupid, because if we don't let people get care or medicine, it means we are creating unnecessary vectors, risks to public health. We are living in the middle of a contagious global pandemic. We should act like it. And one of the things that means is make sure that cost is not a barrier to care. It remains that way for too many people. And again, that was vicious before. It's idiotic now, idiotic for our civilization. And I would rather have Congress make sane, rational, defensible decisions than idiotic ones.
Finally, your opponent, Nancy Pelosi, took a pretty big risk in the language she used to endorse Joe Kennedy. We're taping today is September 1st, election day here in Massachusetts, where Ed Markey is expected to win if the polls hold. But Nancy Pelosi called for a youth movement. We said we needed a youth movement. It sounded to me like the audio for your next TV commercial.
I appreciate that. Yeah, she's absolutely right. We need some fresh voices in Congress. And I think the very first one we need to remove is an incumbent who served for 33 years without ever debating anyone. And I think the idea that someone can serve, I'm using serve in air quotes right now, serve in Congress for a generation, an entire generation, without ever being called on to defend their ideas in public. And just to be clear, when she talks at press conferences, she doesn't do that. That's not a defense against an actual interlocutor. And I think the reason she won't show up for a debate is that she and her entire team knows that if they do, she'll lose the seat, because our platform hews more closely to this proud district's sensibilities. This is not a city that supports relentless wars for profit, which she has. This is not a city that supports predatory for-profit extractive healthcare. She has. This is not a city that supports vicious deportations and border militarizations and concentration camps on our borders, which she has funded. Her record in office has very little relationship to the public construction of her figure. And that's why I'm running for office, because I pay too much attention to be fooled by corporate news. And at the end of the day, if there's a debate in the city and San Francisco has an opportunity to hear the choices before us this November. It's the first time in 33 years that there's been another Democrat on the ballot. And if my city understands the choices before us, I'm very confident that I'll be our next representative in Congress. Well, and I'm looking forward to it.
I hope you get the opportunity to debate. She has a lot of incentive, obviously, not to. Folks, that's our show for today. Shahid Buttar is on the ballot in California's 12th district, but it's a race with national implications. And I'm really grateful to reconnect with you, Shahid. Thanks for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure, Dennis. It's great to see you again, and so glad to reconnect with you as well. Thanks for having me on.
All right, peace.
Peace, brother.